Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. You can have a Microsoft 365 tenant that looks perfectly governed on paper, where every policy is in place and access reviews happen exactly on schedule. Everything seems fine until a single delay occurs, like when a team can't provision a workspace for a new project or someone fails to get a file to a partner fast enough. When the governed path becomes a bottleneck, the work simply moves quietly outside that environment to where it can actually get done. That is the core of what we are discussing today, because risk in Microsoft 365 no longer behaves like a simple policy gap. It behaves like a system outcome. And if you audit your risk the same way you audit business architecture, you will start seeing a very different set of problems. Risk changed shape. Most leaders still imagine Microsoft 365 risk in an older, more traditional form. They look for the dramatic breach, the accidental bad click, or the malicious insider doing something obviously wrong. That model made sense for a long time because the risk signals were visible and easy to classify as a clear violation of policy. Whether a mailbox was compromised or an outsider gained entry, the event felt discrete and local. But here's the thing. Today's risk doesn't usually arrive as an obvious event. It accumulates through ordinary behaviors that feel productive in the moment, such as reusing a sharing link or creating a quick team just to keep a workflow moving. When a file gets copied into a personal tool because the official approval takes too long, it doesn't feel like a security incident to the person doing it. It just feels like work. The reason for this shift is that the environment itself has changed. Microsoft 365 is no longer just a collection of document tools, but rather the operating layer where collaboration, automation, and AI all stack on top of each other. This means small design choices don't stay small for long, and instead, they compound into something much larger. A default sharing behavior quickly becomes long-term exposure, while a fast workspace creation pattern turns into unmanageable sprawl. Once AI enters the picture, all of that existing reality becomes easier to surface and much harder to ignore. The shape of risk changes from a dramatic violation to a simple convenience pathway. It is less about one wrong decision and more about repeated, low-friction choices that expand access over time. Instead of asking who broke the rules, we have to ask what behavior our environment is producing every day. That is a very different leadership question to answer. If you only look for visible control failures, you will miss the structural ones that hide inside speed and self-service. The platform appears governed because the controls are visible, but the actual behavior those controls produce often remains hidden. Leaders can usually see their policy coverage and their secure score, yet they often miss the human reality of the system. They don't see how long people are waiting for access or how often teams duplicate workspaces because the governed path is too slow. When work leaves the tenant because staying inside it became too difficult, that is a sign of a system that is structurally fragile. You can have labels, DLP, and conditional access in place and still create an environment that quietly redirects work into less visible places. From a system perspective, that isn't a governance success, it's structural compensation. The people inside the system are simply solving for time and clarity because they have deadlines and project dependencies that cannot wait for an ideal workflow. When governance adds friction without providing a fast or safe path, the system does exactly what systems do. It roots around the constraint. Many organizations are reading this situation incorrectly because they think the risk sits in misuse. In reality, the risk sits in migration, as work and data move to wherever collaboration feels easiest. Your controls might be technically correct inside Microsoft 365, but business reality has already moved beyond them. A secure-looking environment can still be structurally weak, and a compliant posture can easily hide growing exposure. Risk no longer appears only at the edge where someone breaks a rule. It builds inside the normal flow of work, where convenience slowly outpaces control. So let me take one step back and define what kind of debt we are actually talking about. What structural debt means in Microsoft 365. When I talk about structural debt in Microsoft 365, I am not just referring to outdated scripts, messy code, or some forgotten admin setting buried deep inside a portal. My name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality, which is why I see this as something much broader. Structural debt is the total collection of design choices within your tenant that keep producing risky behavior even when nobody intends to do any harm. This debt shows up as permissions that were granted quickly during a crisis and never pulled back, or workspace creation patterns that made sense during one phase of growth but simply stayed active. Ownership models were never made explicit, and connector approvals happened one request at a time without anyone stepping back to look at the entire shape of the system. Inherited defaults became the normal way of working simply because they were there first, and that is the essence of structural debt. It is the leftover architecture of yesterday's decisions still shaping how your people do their work today. And why does that matter to a business leader? Because Microsoft 365 is not just a technical platform, it is a complete operating environment that determines how work starts and where collaboration actually happens. It dictates how information moves, who can see what, how quickly teams can act, and where the pressure goes when the approved path slows down. If the environment keeps producing oversharing, duplicate workspaces, or off-platform workarounds, we should not read those as a series of unrelated incidents. We should read them as a pattern, or more accurately, a system outcome. Technical debt usually gets framed around maintainability issues like bad code or fragile integrations, and while all of that matters, structural debt in Microsoft 365 goes further because it sits in the behavior layer. It lives in the gap where permissions expand faster than reviews, and it thrives when sites and teams are created without any lifecycle logic to retire them. Files are shared through link types that outlive the original business need, and groups sit without clear owners while apps are connected with only partial visibility. None of these issues are dramatic on their own, which is exactly why they survive for years. Each small choice feels justified because it solved a local problem at the time, but over months and years they stack into a collaboration environment that looks manageable from the control plane while behaving unpredictably in the real world. That is what debt does in a system. It compounds quietly and without warning. In the world of Microsoft 365, it compounds through convenience, and this is where leaders often underestimate what a default setting really means. Defaults do not feel like high-stakes decisions, so they are treated as neutral, vendor-approved, and safe starting points. But defaults are never neutral in a collaboration platform because they shape human behavior faster than any policy document ever will. A user may never read your 50-page governance guide, but they will absolutely experience how fast it is to create a new team or how easy it is to share a sensitive link. The real architecture of your tenant is not what IT wrote down in a PDF, it is what the environment makes easy for the people inside it. This realization changes the executive framing completely because structural debt is not an admin hygiene problem or a cleanup task for when the team has spare capacity. It is a fundamental operating model issue because the platform is shaping business behavior every single day. If workspace ownership is weak, then accountability becomes weak, and if sharing is too easy in the wrong places, visibility will expand much faster than your original intent. If governed collaboration takes too long, work simply leaves the platform for unmanaged tools, and if lifecycle rules are missing, the past keeps staying present. A massive amount of M365 risk is really just old work that never stopped being available to the wrong people. Old project teams, expired sites, and ancient sharing links represent a system that was never retired, meaning the debt is not just what you built, but what you failed to remove. When we talk about AI readiness or Copilot maturity, this is the layer I think leaders need to inspect more honestly than they have in the past. Do not just ask if you have controls in place, but ask what structure you have allowed to accumulate over time. If the tenant keeps rewarding speed without ownership and creation without lifecycle, then the system is doing exactly what it was set up to do. It is producing debt instead of structural resilience, and once you see that, the conversation changes from policy compliance to environmental design. Why default never means neutral? Default sounds harmless because it arrives without a long debate or a formal committee meeting. Nobody gathers in a boardroom and decides to create hidden exposure, and nobody approves a corporate program called future oversharing or a strategy titled unclear ownership at scale. It all starts with settings that are already there, like sharing options that feel practical or creation rights that remove friction to speed up adoption. Because none of it feels dramatic at the start, it gets mistaken for a neutral state of being. But default is never neutral. It is a product decision and a powerful behavior signal. It is the platform telling the people inside it that this specific path is the normal way to operate. In Microsoft 365, this matters immensely because the platform was built to accelerate activation and usage across millions of very different organizations. Microsoft has to provide a starting state that works broadly as a global baseline to get people moving quickly, but a starting state is not the same thing as a risk strategy. A starting state says how the platform can begin, while a risk strategy says how this specific business should operate safely under pressure. Most organizations blur those two concepts together and assume that if a behavior is easy by default, it must be safe enough by design. They believe that if Microsoft ships a feature, it represents a reasonable baseline, and if the control exists somewhere in the tenant, then the risk must already be contained. But that is not how business reality works, because the platform cannot possibly know your specific regulatory environment or your unique partner model. It cannot know which departments deal with sensitive commercial data or which teams collaborate externally every day, and it certainly doesn't know where project velocity creates the highest pressure to bypass process. When leaders inherit default settings and treat them as governance, they are really just inheriting generic enablement without any business context. Generic enablement inside a real organization creates uneven outcomes that feel efficient in one area but become dangerous exposure in another. In one team, self-service works perfectly, but in another, it creates 10 redundant workspaces where one would have done the job. In one project, open sharing speeds up delivery, but in another, it quietly expands access far beyond the people who should still see that material 3 months later. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It is just not designed for what your business actually needs to stay secure. Once you see that, a lot of the confusion around user behavior clears up, and you realize that open sharing is not proof of weak discipline. Easy workspace creation is not proof of strong collaboration maturity, and connector flexibility is not proof of modern governance. These are platform capabilities that are often necessary, but without context, they become engines for structural debt. Defaults enable a technical possibility while simultaneously normalizing a human behavior, and that second part is the one leaders miss most often. People do not experience governance as a set of rules, they experience it as a daily workflow, and they learn the environment by touch. They learn by seeing what happens when they share a file, how quickly they can open a team, and who stops them when they try to connect a new tool. Those small interactions teach the real operating model much faster than any training session or governance document ever will. If the default path is open and fast while the governed path is slow and unclear, the lesson for the employee is obvious. Use the default until somebody tells you no. That is not a failure of the user, it is a system outcome. This is where the executive blind spot gets expensive because default behaviors scale silently and become cultural muscle memory across the entire tenant. Hundreds of small decisions start following the same pattern of sharing first and cleaning up later, except that later rarely comes. Default never means neutral, it means pre-selected behavior at scale, where someone else made an assumption on your behalf. If you do not replace that assumption with your own operating logic, your tenant will still run on a design, but it won't be one aligned to your business. This brings me to the first pattern most organizations normalize without ever noticing it is happening. Pattern 1. Open by default sharing. Open by default sharing is one of those patterns that feels completely reasonable when you look at it one action at a time. Think about the typical Tuesday morning in any office. Someone needs to send a document, a deadline is closing in, or a partner is waiting for an update. A colleague asks for access in a quick chat, or a manager wants a deck reviewed 5 minutes before the meeting starts. In response to that pressure, a link gets created and access gets extended. Another person gets added to the permissions list because it's simply easier than explaining a delay. In that moment, nothing feels reckless or dangerous. It feels responsive, it feels collaborative, and it feels like the platform is finally helping the work move at the speed of business. That's why this pattern survives so easily inside otherwise well-managed environments. It doesn't announce itself as bad behavior or a security breach. It arrives dressed as efficiency. But here's the thing we have to acknowledge. Sharing is not a one-time event. It's an access pattern, and access patterns have memory. The original reason for the share may be valid, the file may genuinely need to move, and the pressure may be real. However, once that link exists, the business context that justified it begins to fade much faster than the access itself. That is the structural problem. The work moves on, the project changes shape, people rotate out of the department, and external partners change. Deadlines pass, but the sharing state often stays behind like a ghost in the system. Now map that reality to how we work today. A file is rarely touched by one person in one place anymore. It gets referenced in chat, forwarded in email, dropped into meetings, and reused in later projects. It gets linked again because someone still has the old URL, and it gets opened by people who were never part of the original decision. Access expands not because someone planned broad exposure, but because each next step feels close enough to the first one to seem harmless. That is how convenience becomes exposure. It doesn't happen through a dramatic mistake or a malicious insider, but through a quiet, steady extension of permissions. This is what makes open by default sharing so difficult for leadership to read. The control surface looks simple on a dashboard, showing that a link was shared internally or externally, but the real risk is cumulative because the file is now part of a spreading access graph that almost nobody sees clearly in real time. One link can become many viewers, and one urgent exception can quickly become normal behavior. One project file can become a reusable entry point into material that no longer matches the original need. That is why oversharing is rarely escalated early in the process. Most people do not experience it as oversharing. They experience it as being helpful. They aren't sitting at their desks thinking about how they are expanding the risk surface of the tenant. They are thinking about not blocking the deal, the workshop, the vendor, or the board update. From their point of view, this is rational behavior. If the environment rewards speed more visibly than it rewards access discipline, then speed wins every single time. This is where a lot of governance conversations become too abstract and lose the plot. Leaders talk about sharing policy as if the issue is a binary choice of whether external sharing is allowed or not. But the deeper issue is how the platform shapes the default sharing decision when a human is under pressure. What is the fastest option? What is the easiest option? What requires the least explanation and avoids waiting for an admin? If the answer keeps pointing to broad link behavior, fast access extension, or inherited permissions nobody fully understands, then the system is training your people toward exposure. It isn't doing this maliciously, but it is doing it structurally. Over time, this creates a very specific kind of debt. You end up with files that are technically accessible to far more people than the business would ever consciously approve if asked directly. You end up with documents whose current visibility no longer reflects their current relevance. You end up with a collaboration culture where access is granted in seconds and rarely pulled back with the same urgency. That asymmetry matters more than we realize. Granting access is immediate, but reviewing access is delayed, and removing access is almost always forgotten. So the access footprint keeps growing. Because this growth happens through normal, everyday work, it rarely triggers the same attention as an obvious security incident. There is no single moment where someone stands up and says, "We have a problem now." Instead, there is just a long series of small accommodations that slowly change who can see what. What starts as convenience becomes uncontrolled exposure. Once that exposure exists, newer layers in Microsoft 365 do not reduce it for you. They operate on top of it. Search operates on top of it, collaboration operates on top of it, and AI operates on top of it, which means the old sharing shortcut does not stay old for long. It becomes tomorrow's visibility problem. How oversharing becomes business risk. This is where a lot of organizations are still using the wrong mental model for risk. They think oversharing only becomes a problem when data leaves the company and ends up in the wrong hands. But inside Microsoft 365, that's no longer the full picture. Internal overexposure is also a massive business risk. If too many people can see the wrong material, you don't just have a confidentiality problem. You have a decision problem, a boundary problem, and a trust problem inside the operating environment itself. This is important because Microsoft 365 no longer behaves like a simple storage layer or a digital filing cabinet. Search traverses what people can access, and Copilot works across what people can access. Summaries, suggestions, grounding, and context retrieval all work across the permission reality that already exists in your tenant. If a file is overshared, the platform does not ask whether that access still makes business sense today. It assumes the access model is intentional and that visibility equals legitimacy. That assumption is where debt starts turning into real business impact. A strategy document shared too broadly can influence people who are never meant to act on it. A draft commercial proposal can surface in the wrong internal context, and a board-related file can become discoverable to people far outside the original decision boundary. An HR document can remain reachable long after the original project closed. None of that requires a hacker or an attacker. It only requires accumulated access. Once AI sits on top of that access model, retrieval becomes faster, easier, and more natural for everyone. People do not need to know where the file lives, they do not need the exact link, and they do not need to remember the site name from 18 months ago. The system can help surface what is already visible. That changes the risk conversation completely. For years, organizations could live with a certain amount of permission messiness because the effort required to find and piece together sensitive content created natural friction. AI reduces that friction to zero. Enterprise search reduces that friction to zero. So the old access mistake becomes newly operational. Oversharing is not just a hygiene issue anymore. It is a force multiplier issue. Every new productivity layer increases the value and the danger of unresolved access debt. This is why so many Copilot readiness conversations eventually circle back to the same uncomfortable truth. The AI is not the problem, the access model is. The files were already there, the permissions were already there, and the open links were already there. Copilot just makes that reality harder to ignore. We have signals for this now, and Microsoft keeps surfacing the same pattern of at-risk files and overshared content. This is not theoretical, it is increasingly measurable. But here's the thing leaders often get wrong. They respond by jumping straight to labels, DLP, or new AI restrictions, as if those tools will erase the history of sharing behavior on their own. They won't. They help, they matter, and they are necessary, but labels do not automatically redesign bad access habits from 3 years ago. DLP does not clean up every broad internal permission that still looks technically valid to the system. Restricted outputs do not fix the structural fact that too much content is already visible to too many people. That is why poor access design turns every new productivity layer into a multiplier for risk. The better the retrieval gets, the more dangerous stale permissions become. The more seamless the search becomes, the less protection you get from organizational memory and human effort. The more useful AI becomes, the more important it is that visibility actually reflects business intent. From an executive perspective, oversharing is not mainly about files. It is about decision quality. It's about who gets context, who acts on partial information, and who sees material before it is ready. It's about who carries out dated assumptions because old documents remain easy to surface. That is business risk. It isn't dramatic or cinematic, but it is deeply operational. Once you understand that, you stop treating oversharing as a side issue in collaboration governance and start seeing it for what it is, an architectural weakness in the visibility model of the business. But data access is only one side of the debt problem. Pattern 2. Teams and workspace sprawl. If oversharing is about visibility expanding too far, workspace sprawl is about the collaboration surface expanding too fast. Most of the time, this starts with something that feels positive, like a new project beginning or a department wanting its own team. A steering group needs a shared space, or someone creates a site because the existing one feels messy, and a new channel appears because it is faster than cleaning up the old structure. None of that looks irresponsible in the moment because it looks like momentum. That is why Teams and workspace sprawl is so easy to normalize inside Microsoft 365. The platform makes creation simple, which is a good thing because collaboration should not require a ticket queue and a 2-week wait for every new need. But when creation is fast and operating models are slow, the result is not agility, it is fragmentation. You start seeing multiple teams for the same initiative, including one for the original project, one for vendor collaboration, and another because the first one became cluttered. Someone leaves and nobody wants to touch the old space, or a department wants their own version of the conversation, so they just build another one. Now map that across a year, a merger, or shifting priorities across dozens of departments. You do not get one collaboration environment, you get layers of Teams, Microsoft 365 groups, and SharePoint sites. These layers of channels, folders, files, and permissions each solved a local problem, and that is the trap. From a local perspective, the decision often made sense, but from a structural perspective, the estate becomes harder to manage with every new workspace added. Workspaces do not just hold content, they hold context, access, and assumptions about ownership and relevance. When duplication grows, knowledge fragments with it, and people stop knowing where the current version lives or which team is actually active, they stop knowing whether a file in one site is a final version, a draft, or something abandoned, which means they stop trusting the environment as a single source of truth. That is not just clutter, it is governance geometry, where the shape of the environment starts working against the people inside it. And then there is the quieter problem, which is that inactive does not mean harmless. A team can look dead and still hold live permissions, just as a site can feel forgotten while still containing sensitive documents. A project space can be operationally finished and still remain searchable, shareable, and discoverable far beyond its business life. This is where the metric matters, because large portions of Teams environments become inactive over time while the data stays accessible. That means yesterday's project becomes today's risk surface, not because someone attacked it, but because nobody retired it. This happens because most organizations are much better at provisioning collaboration than decommissioning it. They know how to start work, but they are far less disciplined about ending work structurally. Ownership fades, sponsors move on, and project managers rotate out as departments reorganize. The business memory of why the workspace existed disappears faster than the workspace itself. So the container remains, the access remains, and the files remain alongside the discoverability. That is structural debt. Once enough of these spaces accumulate, governance becomes reactive by definition, and reviews take longer because nobody is sure who owns what. Cleanup becomes politically awkward because deleting the wrong team might affect someone silently, still depending on it, making retention and access reviews more expensive because the environment has lost its logical boundaries. This is why I do not think workspace sprawl should be framed as a storage issue, as storage is the least interesting part of it. The real cost is decision drag, ownership decay, and risk surface growth. People waste time searching across duplicate spaces, and leaders make decisions from inconsistent versions of the truth. Security teams struggle to review an estate with unclear accountability, and new layers like Copilot inherit all of it. A sprawl problem is never just about too many teams. It is about an environment that kept saying yes to creation and never built an equally strong path for consolidation, lifecycle, and closure, which means the platform keeps expanding but coherence does not. And once coherence breaks, control gets expensive fast. Why workspace sprawl becomes structural risk? So let's push this one step further. Workspace sprawl becomes structural risk when the collaboration environment stops reflecting the actual operating model of the business. At first, extra teams and sites look like a cleanliness problem with too many containers and channels, but that reading is too shallow. The real issue is that fragmented workspaces fragment accountability, decision-making, and trust in the environment itself. When one initiative lives across 5 spaces, nobody has a clean view of the work anymore. One team has the meeting notes, another has the latest deck, and a SharePoint site has the original project documents. A private channel holds the sensitive discussion, and then a separate workspace appears because a supplier needs access and no one wants to untangle the existing permissions. Now, nobody is dealing with one collaboration system, they are dealing with a scattered memory of one. And why is that dangerous? Because businesses make decisions through context, not just content. A document on its own is rarely enough, as people need to know whether it is current, who owns it, and what decision it supported. They need to know what assumptions changed and whether another team is working from a newer version somewhere else. Once workspaces multiply faster than operating discipline, that context breaks apart. The cost shows up in very ordinary ways, like slower meetings because people argue about which file is current. Duplicated work happens because one team cannot find what another already built, and conflicting reporting occurs because two groups pull numbers from different spaces. Delayed approvals happen because nobody knows who can authorize cleanup, access changes, or closure. This is not just inefficiency, it is structural ambiguity. Ambiguous environments are hard to govern because the business meaning of the workspace is no longer obvious from the workspace itself. That leads straight into ownership decay. Most workspaces begin with momentum, a sponsor, and a project manager. But once the project slows down or the original people move on, ownership becomes implied instead of explicit. That is where risk starts compounding. If nobody clearly owns the workspace, nobody reviews the permissions with urgency, nobody asks whether external access still makes sense, and nobody checks whether the data should move to a record location. Nobody decides whether the team should be archived, retained differently, or removed from normal discoverability. The container just stays there. From a system perspective, that is a classic single point of failure. The workspace still affects access, search, and visibility, but the human accountability behind it has dissolved. The structure remains active after the intent has disappeared. And once that happens at scale, security reviews become harder in a very specific way. It is not because the controls are missing, it is because the accountability chain is missing. You can run an access review and identify inactive teams, but if nobody in the business can clearly say if it still matters, the review becomes slow and politically sensitive. So cleanup gets postponed, risk stays in place, and the estate keeps expanding. That is why retention, discovery, and remediation become expensive in sprawling environments. Every legal hold and every audit question has to travel through a larger and less coherent map. The organization is not just storing more information, it is storing more unresolved structure. And this is where AI raises the stakes again, because fragmented workspaces do not just confuse people, they confuse machine-assisted retrieval less than they confuse humans. A person may not remember the old team from 18 months ago, but the platform can still find it. A manager may not know that 3 versions of the same project narrative exist across 3 spaces, but search can still surface them. An agent does not care that a site feels abandoned because if access still exists, the context is still available. So workspace sprawl is not a visual mess sitting quietly in the background. It is a visibility problem, a trust problem, and an accountability problem. It is the business carrying too many half-retired containers with live consequences. That is why I call it structural risk. It is not because there are too many teams, but because the environment has lost the clean relationship between work ownership and closure. Now map that to how work actually flows across modern teams. Pattern 3, unmanaged connectors and apps. This is the point where many organizations discover that their Microsoft 365 boundary is much more porous than they assumed. Work does not stay inside the tenant just because the tenant is where that work started, and that reality creates a massive visibility gap for leadership. A team might use SharePoint for documents, Teams for meetings, and Outlook for coordination, perhaps even setting up a single Power Automate workflow to handle basic tasks. Then the pressure shows up. A reporting need appears that the current setup does not handle well, or a partner needs a smoother handoff, and suddenly the standard tools feel like a bottleneck. The department decides they need a dashboard, a sync, or an approval shortcut to keep things moving. To solve this, someone connects an app through OAuth, a browser extension, or a connector inside Teams, often building a low-code automation quickly to avoid repetitive manual work. They might use an external SaaS tool that asks for access to OneDrive, SharePoint, and Mailbox content, yet none of this feels dramatic at the point of use. It feels operationally normal. That is what makes unmanaged connectors and apps so difficult to read, because they rarely arrive as visible acts of defiance. They arrive as productivity decisions. These are small pieces of structural compensation where people are trying to close the gap between what the approved environment allows and what the work actually requires. Now, this is important because connectors change the shape of governance. When a document sits inside a governed SharePoint site, your controls and review logic still have a fighting chance of working. When that same content starts flowing through third-party services and external workflow engines, the governance picture changes immediately. This shift doesn't happen because the tool is malicious, but rather because the visibility chain breaks. You may still know the app exists in a technical sense, and you might even know who approved it, but you often lose practical clarity on the questions that matter in business reality. What data is actually moving? How often is it moving? And who else can access it once it arrives at the destination? You lose sight of what retention model applies or what audit trail still exists, and the problem gets worse when the original owner leaves the company. When the business process changes but the connector stays active, that is where unmanaged extension becomes structural debt. A connector that solved one narrow problem can quietly create a long-term data path nobody is actively governing. An app added to accelerate one team can become an access bridge far beyond the original use case, and a workflow built in a hurry can turn into a hidden operational dependency with no real ownership model around it. And this is where Shadow IT often gets misread. Leaders look at these tools and wonder why people are bypassing standards, but the more useful question is, what in the environment made the bypass feel necessary? Because if a connector is the only fast path to complete the work, then that choice is evidence that the governed path is not aligned to execution pressure. That does not make unmanaged apps harmless, it makes them legible. They tell you exactly where the system is losing people. Once data starts moving through those paths, Microsoft 365 governance does not automatically follow it with the same strength. Sensitivity labels may not carry cleanly, and conditional access may protect the front door while doing very little about what happens after information lands somewhere else. The organization ends up in a dangerous illusion where the tenant looks governed and the dashboards show control, but the real workflow has stretched beyond the places those controls can fully explain. Your governance stops where your visibility ends. If you are serious about structural resilience, that line should bother you. Unmanaged connectors are no longer edge cases, as they have become the hidden plumbing of modern work. The question is not whether they exist, but whether your operating model can see them clearly enough to decide which ones should be enabled, redesigned, or removed. Shadow it is structural compensation. This is the moment where I think leadership language has to change. Most organizations still talk about shadow IT as if it were mainly a discipline problem where people are framed as careless or weak on compliance. The assumption is that if they would just follow the rules, the problem would go away. But if you look closely, that explanation is too thin. Shadow IT usually appears where friction accumulates faster than the approved system can respond. A team is blocked waiting for access, or a workspace request sits in a queue while delivery pressure keeps rising, and eventually a workaround appears. This doesn't happen because people want less governance, but because they need more throughput. That distinction matters. When employees bypass Microsoft 365, they are not rejecting governance. They are compensating for it. They are compensating for slow approval paths and rigid controls that do not match the speed of execution. That is not an emotional problem, it's a system outcome. And why is that? Because busy professionals optimize for completion under pressure. They are measured on delivery and client outcomes, not on how elegantly they stayed inside the approved workflow while a critical decision stalled for 3 days. If the official system slows the work does not politely stop and wait for governance maturity to improve. It relocates. Shadow, it is not just technology outside IT oversight. It is displaced work. When files, conversations, and approvals move to personal productivity tools or unmanaged AI services, the organization loses its line of sight. The real operating path has already shifted because everyone was too busy solving the immediate problem to wait for a formal approval. I believe shadow IT should be read less like rebellion and more like a pressure map. It shows you where the formal design of the environment no longer matches the actual demands placed on the people inside it. If one team keeps bypassing file sharing rules, the issue is likely not their attitude, but a structural misalignment with the work. That does not mean every workaround should be tolerated, but it does mean every workaround should be interpreted. Workarounds are diagnostic tools that tell you where friction is highest and where the business has outgrown a control model that assumes low velocity. From a system perspective, a restriction-first model often looks strong because it reduces movement inside the environment. However, if that reduction creates unmanaged alternatives outside the environment, then the risk did not go away. It migrated. The real leadership question is no longer how to stop bad behavior, but what behavior the environment reliably produces when work is under pressure. Shadow IT is often the system telling you something your dashboards are not. The governed path is too slow, too unclear, or too disconnected from business reality. Once you understand that, the response changes. You stop treating every workaround as proof that people cannot be trusted and start treating it as design feedback from the people inside the system. Which brings me to a very ordinary scenario that shows how quickly this risk migration happens. The project that left the platform. Let me ground this in a scenario that is completely ordinary. A project starts inside Microsoft 365 exactly the way leadership would want it to. There is a team, a SharePoint site sitting behind it, and permissions are tightly controlled. External sharing is limited, the environment looks responsible, and from an audit perspective, everything begins in the right place. Now put a real project inside that structure. There are internal stakeholders, an external partner, and time-sensitive documents that need to move. Commercial pressure is mounting and meetings are already scheduled before the access model is even fully sorted out. The project team does what most teams do and they simply begin working. Early drafts go into the team, notes are shared, and files are updated until the first delay shows up. A partner needs access to a set of documents, but the request hits a control point where the sharing rule is too restrictive for the scenario. Maybe the approval route is correct on paper but too slow for the actual deadline, or perhaps no one is fully sure which path is allowed, so the request sits while people clarify ownership. That moment is small, but it matters. Projects do not experience delay as a governance discussion. They experience it as lost momentum. So someone says, just for now, let's use the external tool the partner already has. Someone else says they will move it back later. A folder is created outside Microsoft 365 and a few documents are copied across so the meeting can happen. Then another file gets added because it is easier than keeping two environments aligned manually, and soon comments and version decisions are happening there. People begin assuming that is now the working location, even though the official project still exists inside the tenant. Within weeks, the center of gravity has shifted. The project did not announce that it was leaving the platform. It just followed the path of least resistance. And this is the key point. Nothing in that story requires bad intent. The people involved are not trying to create risk. They are trying to keep delivery on track, avoid embarrassing delays, and maintain trust with the partner while keeping the internal program moving. From their point of view, the workaround is rational. From a leadership point of view, it is often invisible until much later. The team still exists, the SharePoint site still exists, and the policies still exist. The governance dashboard still suggests that the collaboration environment is intact, but the real project has already split across two systems. And once that happens, the costs start stacking fast. First, visibility drops to zero outside the approved environment. This isn't just reduced visibility, it is a full loss of insight into the off-platform working reality. Second, compliance exposure rises immediately because the copied documents now sit in a place where your Microsoft 365 controls no longer apply. Third, decision-making slows down in a different way. This isn't because access is blocked, but because information is fragmented. One version is in the team, while another is in the external space, and people are no longer sure which comments are current or where the authoritative discussion happened. That is the irony. The workaround solved the first delay, but then it created a larger structural problem. Most organizations only notice this kind of shift after the fact. It might happen during an audit, a legal request, or when someone asks for a file trail and finds that key decisions happened outside the governed platform. Sometimes it only comes to light when Copilot readiness work reveals that the important project knowledge is not actually where leadership assumed it would be. So when I say the biggest risks do not come from misuse of Microsoft 365, this is what I mean. The biggest risks often come from work happening outside of it. This isn't because Microsoft 365 failed technically. It's because the operating model around it failed to hold the work inside governed paths when pressure increased. That is a very different diagnosis. Once you see that pattern clearly, you stop asking only whether the platform is secure. You start asking whether the platform is usable enough, fast enough, and aligned enough to keep real work from quietly leaving it. Why friction creates risk migration. And why is that? Because friction almost never removes demand. It just changes the route demand takes. That is one of the biggest mistakes in Microsoft 365 governance thinking. Leaders assume that if they block a risky behavior inside the platform, the risk has been reduced. Sometimes that is true, but very often, the need itself does not disappear. The deadline is still there, the partner still needs access, and the file still needs to move. If the governed route becomes too slow or too hard to use, people do not stop needing progress. They find another path. That is risk migration. The risky act does not vanish, it relocates. Structurally, that should change how we read almost every friction point in the tenant. A blocked share may become an external transfer, and a delayed workspace may become an unofficial tool. A confusing approval model may become a parallel process in email or some third-party app that no one intended to become business critical. From a system perspective, the organization has not reduced complexity. It has exported it into places with weaker visibility. That is why restriction-first governance can be so deceptive. It looks strong because it visibly limits movement inside the approved environment. Fewer permissions, fewer creation rights, and more checkpoints can look like tighter control on paper. But if each new restriction increases the probability that work continues somewhere else, then the control model is creating its own shadow layer. And that shadow layer is almost always harder to govern than the original behavior would have been inside Microsoft 365. This is where I think leaders need more empathy for the people inside the system. Busy professionals are not usually making irrational choices when they use workarounds. They are solving for time, clarity, and completion under pressure. If a procurement team needs to review supplier files this afternoon and access provisioning takes 3 days, the team is not going to admire the purity of the governance model. They are going to solve the immediate problem. If a project lead cannot get an approved workspace quickly enough, they are going to start the work where the work can start. That behavior is predictable. It is not a moral failure. It is an environmental response. Workaround behavior is often one of the clearest indicators that governance has become structurally misaligned with execution. Many organizations still measure only the visible side of the equation. They track policies enabled, reviews completed, and controls deployed. All of that matters, but if you do not also measure where friction is redirecting work, then you are missing the real movement of risk. You need to know how long approved access actually takes and how often teams request exceptions. You should look for where people move work when sharing fails, which external tools appear around blocked workflows, and how many projects start inside Microsoft 365 but continue somewhere else. Those are risk signals too. In some ways, they are the more honest ones because they show you the system under pressure rather than the system as documented. Once you start looking through that lens, a lot of governance debates change. The question stops being whether we should be strict or permissive. The better question becomes, can the safest path hold the real workload of the business? If the answer is no, then friction becomes a routing mechanism. It sends sensitive work outward, it sends urgent collaboration into unmanaged spaces, and it sends decision-making into fragmented environments where your Microsoft 365 controls no longer travel with the work. That is why I keep saying risk is migrating, not disappearing. A blocked action inside the tenant may simply create an invisible action outside it. If leadership celebrates the first part while missing the second, the organization becomes more fragile, not less. The real governance challenge is not only to stop harmful behavior, it is to understand what your environment makes people do next when the approved path breaks, because that next step is where unmanaged risk usually begins. Why traditional risk thinking breaks here? The old leadership question just isn't enough anymore. For a long time, the way we handled Microsoft 365 governance was pretty simple, and it usually boiled down to one thing: how do we prevent bad behavior? We focused on stopping the wrong share, the wrong download, or the wrong app click. Those controls still matter, and we definitely still need policy reviews, logging, and access management to keep the lights on. But if we only ask that one question, we're stuck in an outdated risk model where risk is only seen as a violation. In that old world, we assumed someone did something they shouldn't have, a rule was bypassed, or an outsider got in. The problem today is that most Microsoft 365 risk doesn't actually start with an obvious violation. Instead, it starts with normal, well-meaning behavior happening inside a poorly aligned environment. When speed is rewarded, a project shares data too broadly. And when no closure model exists, a workspace stays alive forever. If the official path can't keep up, a connector gets approved anyway, and teams move work outside the tenant because a delay feels more dangerous than a policy drift. None of those actions look like classic bad behavior when they start. And that is exactly why traditional risk thinking breaks down. It spends all its time looking for specific incidents, but the environment is actually producing patterns. These patterns are much harder to spot if your governance language is still built around misclicks or explicit misuse. From a system perspective, the better question is this: what behavior does our environment reliably produce when people are under pressure? This is a much more uncomfortable question because it shifts accountability upward. It forces leadership to look past whether a control exists and ask if the operating environment makes the right behavior practical at the point of work. Checklists are great at confirming a control is present, but they are terrible at explaining behavioral outcomes. You can have sharing controls, sensitivity labels, and lifecycle policies all configured while your secure score improves every quarter, and you might still have a tenant that teaches people to work around friction. That is the ultimate blind spot. Traditional governance reporting is excellent at showing what has been deployed, but it's very weak at showing what the people inside the environment are being pushed to do next. Leaders see coverage and assume they have containment, but compliance can easily coexist with structural fragility. It sounds uncomfortable because it is. An environment can be technically governed and behaviorally unstable at the exact same time. The dashboards might say the controls are on, but the people inside the system are likely compensating around them every single day. This is why we have to read secure score and policy inventories more carefully. They describe the presence of a defensive structure, but they don't describe the lived experience of working inside that structure. They won't tell you if access takes too long or if teams are duplicating workspaces because the approved model is too rigid. When leaders rely only on these traditional views, they end up asking the wrong follow-up questions. They ask where someone broke a policy when they should be asking where the policy is actually creating compensation behavior. They ask how to tighten a control instead of asking what new unmanaged path that tightening will create. Instead of just asking if the organization is compliant, we should be asking if the environment is structurally resilient under a real workload. Old risk thinking looks for the event, but better risk thinking looks for the pattern generator. Once work becomes faster and more AI-assisted, the real threat isn't just an isolated incident of misuse. The threat is the repeated production of risky behavior by design. If that's the case, then Microsoft 365 risk can't be managed as a simple prevention exercise. It has to be treated as an environment design problem, which requires a different lens entirely. We need a view that reads behavior, friction, and drift as signals of how the platform is actually shaping business reality. The leadership blind spot, visible controls, invisible behavior. This is the point where leadership often feels the most confident and the most exposed at the same time. From an executive seat, Microsoft 365 risk can look like it's reasonably well contained because there are policies, licenses, and admin roles in place. When the secure score trend moves in the right direction and presentations show full control coverage, it leads to a very understandable conclusion. We assume that because we can see the controls, we must be seeing the risk. But those two things are not the same. Controls are visible because they are configured, but behavior is much harder to see because it happens in motion. This gap matters more now than ever before. A tenant can look perfectly clean at the control layer while producing incredibly messy behavior at the operating layer. The sharing settings might be documented and the provisioning model might be available, but none of that tells you what people experience on a Thursday afternoon when stakeholders are waiting and a deadline is slipping. That is the blind spot. Executives often inherit a reporting model that emphasizes what IT and security can count easily, like how many policies are enabled or how many labels are applied. While those are useful signals, they are lagging indicators of a control posture rather than leading signals of how people are compensating. Leaders usually don't see how long people are waiting for access or how often teams create duplicate workspaces because they don't trust the official ones. In many organizations, this operational risk telemetry barely makes it into the governance conversation because it sits in the gaps between functions. It sees the control and security sees the exposure, while the business feels the friction and operations feel the delay. Since nobody is translating those experiences into one shared language, leadership gets the architecture of policy without the architecture of behavior. Once you miss that, structural debt begins to accumulate quietly. The gap between what the policy intends and what happens in daily execution gets wider every day. People build local compensations and teams normalize workarounds, while managers assume the approved process is being followed just because it exists. Meanwhile, the real work starts flowing through different routes entirely. This is why so many executive reviews create a sense of false reassurance. A dashboard can confirm that external sharing is restricted, but it can't show you how many people switched to a personal tool after that restriction blocked their path. A report might show that workspace provisioning follows the rules, but it won't show how many teams avoided the process because it felt too slow for their timeline. When leaders say they have governance in place, they are often right in a technical sense, but the deeper question is whether the environment produces governed behavior when it counts. That is a much higher standard to meet. IT, security, and business operations need a shared language to bridge this gap. Without that language, every group only sees one part of the picture. IT says the process exists, and security says the risk is covered, but the business says the work can't move fast enough. Everyone is partially right, yet the organization remains structurally fragile. If we want better risk decisions at the leadership level, our reporting has to mature beyond just looking at visible controls. It has to include signals like waiting time, exception frequency, and off-platform work patterns. These aren't just side metrics, they are direct evidence of how the environment behaves under pressure. Once you start reading Microsoft 365 through that lens, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. AI doesn't actually create this blind spot, it just exposes it. If you audited your behavioral resilience the same way you audit your technical controls, you might find a system that is designed to fail the moment things get moving. The question is whether that system is built to sustain your people or slowly drain them over time. Says why AI governance makes structural debt impossible to ignore. AI has changed the stakes for every modern organization because it removes the last line of defense that messy digital environments used to rely on. I'm talking about friction. For years, a massive amount of structural debt stayed hidden simply because people had to work hard to find anything. You had to remember exactly which team owned a project. You had to know where a specific file lived, and you had to navigate a cluttered SharePoint structure that felt like a digital labyrinth. If you didn't know the history, you had to find someone who did. In that world, human effort acted like a rough, accidental barrier that kept the mess from causing too much trouble. But now that barrier is weakening faster than most leaders realize. Copilot, enterprise search, and the new wave of AI agents do not experience your environment the way your employees do. These tools do not get tired, they never forget the names of old workspaces, and they don't avoid a stale site just because it looks abandoned or outdated. If the access exists, the machine will use it. If the context is reachable, the AI will retrieve it. When a document is visible because of inherited permissions from 3 years ago, the machine doesn't pause to ask if that still reflects your current business intent. The system simply works with the reality it is given, regardless of whether that reality is organized or dangerous. This is why AI governance isn't a separate conversation from your Microsoft 365 governance strategy. It is a high-pressure stress test of the foundation you've already built. Every overshared file becomes easier for the wrong person to surface, and every orphaned workspace becomes a goldmine for a non-human actor to extract context you thought was buried. Because these agents can operate across structures that humans no longer understand, the old language of readiness has become far too soft for the current moment. Organizations often claim they are preparing for Copilot or evaluating new AI use cases, but if you look closely, they are actually confronting unresolved structural debt that AI has suddenly made operational. The problem was already sitting there in the dark. AI is just accelerating the consequence of ignoring it. A search tool that returns a perfect answer from overshared data isn't the thing creating the oversharing problem. When an agent grounds its logic in stale project content, the agent isn't the one who created the outdated files. If a Copilot response surfaces a sensitive document from an inactive team, the AI didn't create that inactive team or the permissions that left it open. The environment already allowed it to happen, and that is the uncomfortable truth most teams are trying to avoid. AI removes the illusion that messy access is harmless. We used to think that because people were too busy or too confused to exploit bad structure, we were safe, but machines do not share those human limitations. This means your governance can no longer rely on obscurity, memory gaps, or operational friction to soften the blow of a bad setup. Once agents enter the picture, the challenge gets even wider. We are no longer just talking about what a human can find and read. We are talking about what a non-human actor can process, summarize, and act on inside the boundaries you have set, whether you intended to set them that way or not. If your boundaries are weak, AI scales that weakness. If your ownership is unclear, AI isn't going to repair it. When connectors spread data into places you can't see, AI deepens that visibility gap instead of closing it. This is exactly why so many organizations are slowing down their AI rollouts, even while leadership is screaming for more speed. It usually isn't a lack of ambition or a fear of the technology itself. It is the weight of unresolved structural debt. They know the platform can do more, but they are less sure the environment underneath it can support that power safely. From a system perspective, treating AI governance as a one-time setup is a guaranteed path to failure. It fails for the same reason that Microsoft 365 governance fails when it's treated like a static project. The environment keeps moving, access drifts over time, workspaces accumulate like digital clutter, and ownership eventually decays. The structure of your business changes much faster than a static set of controls can ever explain. So AI governance has to evolve into continuous operational governance. It's not just about who gets a Copilot license or which agent is approved for use. It's about the data model, the permission model, and the visibility model that those tools are now amplifying. AI makes structural debt impossible to ignore because it turns quiet, dormant weaknesses into active, scalable capabilities. The machine can only be as trustworthy as the environment it stands on. Once you see that clearly, the answer isn't to slow everything down forever. The real solution is to stop confusing restriction with actual readiness. Restriction versus resilience. So what do we actually do with this realization? When leaders finally see the debt clearly, their first instinct is almost always to tighten the screws. They want to lock down sharing, reduce creation rights, block every connector, and slow down approvals until every single exception is reviewed by a committee. I understand why that happens. If the environment feels messy and out of control, restriction looks like a form of discipline. But here is the thing we have to get right. Restriction and resilience are not the same thing. Restriction tries to reduce risk by limiting movement, while resilience tries to keep that movement inside governed paths. That distinction matters more than ever in a world of Microsoft 365 and AI. Collaboration environments are not static systems. They are living operating surfaces where people need to create, share, and adapt in real time. If you design your governance as if the safest environment is the one where the fewest things happen, you might reduce visible movement, but you also guarantee that the real work will just move somewhere else. That isn't resilience, that is just pressure displacement. From a system perspective, over-restriction is fragile because it forces the people inside the system to find external ways to compensate. The system looks perfectly controlled on a dashboard, right up until the moment real work hits a wall, and then the work simply reroutes. A resilient model works differently because it assumes the business will never stop moving. It assumes teams will always need speed, that exceptions are not rare, and that collaboration pressure is a normal part of the day rather than an accident to be avoided. Instead of asking how to stop people from doing risky things, resilience asks a much better question. How do we make the governed path the easiest path for people to take under real-world conditions? That is a design question, not a policy question. Once you frame it that way, your entire governance posture starts to shift. You stop seeing enablement as the enemy of control and start seeing it as the very thing that makes control sustainable. If a safe way to collaborate takes 3 days, but the unsafe way takes 3 minutes, the unsafe path will win every single time. It doesn't matter how strong your policy language sounds in a steering committee meeting. People follow the route that preserves their momentum, and that is a fundamental law of human systems. Structural resilience means your safe paths are actually faster than the unsafe ones. They don't have to be perfect or completely frictionless, but they must be more usable than the alternatives you are trying to prevent. This means your approved workspace creation has to be fast, and your external collaboration needs a model that people can actually use without a headache. Labels and protections have to be embedded so early in the process that people aren't being asked to fix their behavior after the work is already done. Ownership has to be visible, life cycles have to be automated, and connector decisions need to be explained in a way that makes sense to the business. This is where most governance programs get stuck. They are built as control systems rather than operating systems. They are great at defining what should not happen, but they are incredibly weak at shaping what should happen instead. When you leave that gap open, the people inside the system will close it themselves. We call that closure shadow IT or off-platform work or unmanaged AI, but it's all the same pattern. The business is simply compensating for a missing governed fast lane. Now, it's important to remember that resilience isn't the same as being soft. It isn't about permissive chaos or saying yes to every random app or workspace request that comes across your desk. It is about building a system strong enough to hold real work inside the environment rather than just being strong enough to refuse it. That is a much higher leadership standard. It asks whether your operating model can absorb pressure without breaking into invisible side channels that you can't see or manage. That is the business reality leaders need to face right now. You don't need tighter control alone. You need enablement with guardrails. You need a collaboration environment where your people can move quickly without constantly feeling like they have to step outside your line of sight to get their jobs done. In the era of AI, the cost of fragile governance goes up every single day. Every workaround creates a new blind spot. and every blind spot weakens your visibility until you can no longer govern what comes next. The goal isn't to build a tenant that looks controlled from the outside. The goal is to build one that stays governable while the business is actually moving inside it. Which brings me to the practical shift that leaders can start piloting today, the 30-day shift enablement with guardrails. So let's make this practical. If restriction alone is fragile and resilience means keeping real work inside governed paths, then leaders need a shift they can test quickly without launching another 12-month transformation program. This is where I'd start. For the next 30 days, I want you to stop asking how to prevent every risky act and start asking how to make the governed path the easiest path for your people to follow. That sounds simple, but it changes your whole operating posture. Prevention-first governance usually begins with fear, focusing on what could go wrong, what should be blocked, or which actions require another layer of manual approval. While some of that is necessary, if your first design instinct is always to add friction, you will keep producing the same compensation behavior you say you want to reduce. A 30-day shift is different because it isn't a full redesign, but rather a pressure test of your existing infrastructure. You choose one collaboration-heavy area of the business, such as a specific department or a program type where speed and coordination matter every single week. Do not pick the quietest area. Pick the one under real execution pressure. If you want to know whether your governance can actually hold the business, you have to test it where the business is moving the fastest. Then you ask a small set of harder questions. Where does work stall today? Where do people wait for access, workspace creation, or sharing decisions? And where do they leave Microsoft 365 when that waiting becomes unacceptable? You need to figure out which requests are genuinely high risk and which ones are just low risk collaboration wrapped in a slow, outdated process. That distinction matters. Many organizations apply the same operational drag to ordinary collaboration that they should reserve for sensitive exceptions, and the result is entirely predictable. Low-risk work gets pushed into unofficial channels because the approved route feels disproportionate to the task at hand. In this 30-day pilot, the goal is not maximum control, but structural alignment. You design one governed route that is clearly faster and easier than the unofficial alternative for that specific work pattern. That usually involves three specific things. First, workspace startup has to be fast, and I don't mean eventually or after a chain of ambiguity. It must be fast enough that teams do not feel they need to start somewhere else and try to move the data back later. Second, governance has to be embedded early. Permissions, ownership, and basic sensitivity handling should not arrive as cleanup work after collaboration is already underway. These elements should arrive with the workspace itself because that is where behavior gets shaped. Third, the business has to understand the zones, meaning they need to know what is open, what is controlled, and what requires tighter rules. If people cannot tell the difference operationally, they will improvise, and when people improvise under pressure, the structure usually gets weaker instead of stronger. The success criteria for a pilot like this should not be framed only in security language. Risk reduction matters, but if you only measure policy compliance, you will miss whether the design actually worked for the human beings using it. You need to measure adoption, startup speed, and exception reduction to see if off-platform work is decreasing because the official path got easier to use. These are resilience metrics that show whether the environment is holding demand instead of exporting it. The executive role here is very specific. You must sponsor faster governed workflows rather than just demanding stricter reviews. Leadership has to give permission for a different kind of conversation, one that says we are not lowering standards, but reducing avoidable friction so those standards can actually scale. If the safest path is still the slowest path, nothing fundamental changes and people will simply nod in meetings while compensating in their daily operations. But if one part of the business experiences safe work that is also quick work, you create proof that enablement with guardrails is actually stronger governance. Pilot Design Part 1: Friction-Free Workspace Creation. So here is the first part of the pilot, and in my view, it is the part that changes the most behavior the fastest. Friction-free workspace creation is not about uncontrolled chaos or random self-service, but about building a startup model for collaboration that is fast enough for real work. That distinction matters because many organizations hear the word speed and immediately imagine a lack of control. Speed is not the problem, but ungoverned speed and slow governance both create significant risks for the organization. If a team has to wait days to get the right place to start, the system is already teaching them that governance happens before work rather than with it. The pilot should begin by reducing the delay between intent and execution so a team can receive a workspace in minutes. The first hour of a project shapes a lot more behavior than the fifth policy reminder you send out. If people can start quickly in a governed Microsoft 365 space with the basics already in place, they are far more likely to keep the work there. If they cannot, they will improvise somewhere else and promise themselves they will tidy it up later, which usually never happens. The goal here is simple. Make start work safely easier than start work somewhere else. This means creating standardized templates for teams and SharePoint built around the most common patterns of work, like project teams, department collaboration, or external partner spaces. You don't need 50 options, just a small number of operationally clear patterns that arrive with core decisions already embedded. Each workspace should come with a defined owner, a naming logic, and a sharing posture that fits that specific kind of work. This is where you start interrupting structural debt early, because instead of asking people to build the right structure manually, the environment gives them a usable starting architecture. They do not begin with an empty shell, but with a governed container that already reflects their business intent. Provisioning speed without embedded rules just recreates the same problem faster, so the pilot has to treat workspace creation as a design event. A workspace should carry an owner model, a permission baseline, and a business-readable purpose that helps people make better decisions with less hesitation. When the workspace type is clear, it reduces improvisation because the environment is already signaling how the space should behave. In practice, this also means removing avoidable approval loops for low-risk cases where many organizations create unnecessary drag. They route ordinary collaboration through the same slow path they reserve for sensitive scenarios and then wonder why people avoid the process entirely. From a system perspective, that is not caution, it is just poor throughput design that forces people to look for workarounds. Low-risk collaboration should have a fast lane. If a marketing team needs a standard internal team for a campaign or a project team needs a governed external space, it should not feel like a long compliance negotiation. The safer route should be operationally obvious. You request it, it provisions, and you start working with the right defaults already in place. That is what makes this first pilot step so important. It does not solve every governance problem, but it changes the opening move. And opening moves matter because structural debt often begins the moment work starts in the wrong place. And if you fix that moment, you reduce compensation behavior before it spreads and keep the center of gravity inside Microsoft 365. You preserve visibility, ownership, and the chance to govern what comes next, but speed on its own is not enough. If the workspace appears quickly, but the boundaries inside it are still vague, the organization just accelerates the existing ambiguity. So the second part of the pilot has to answer a harder question. How do we build governance into the space from the beginning without making it feel like a rigid system? Pilot design part 2, built-in governance and clear zones. So we've reached the second part of the pilot and the workspace is appearing quickly now, which is exactly what we want to see. But here's the thing, we have to make sure that space doesn't just sit there empty or unmanaged. Fast creation without built-in governance doesn't actually solve a problem, it just shifts the mess further down the road. The team might get the speed they asked for, but the organization inherits a cloud of ambiguity, and that ambiguity is exactly where structural debt starts rebuilding itself almost immediately. The next move is simple because governance has to arrive at the same time as the workspace, not as an afterthought. This means that ownership cannot be an optional field or something that depends on whether a busy person remembers to fill in metadata 3 weeks later. We can't let these tasks sit in a separate cleanup backlog that nobody ever touches because the project has already moved on to the next phase. Every single space needs a visible, named owner from the very first day it exists. This isn't just about technical administration or having someone to click the buttons, it's about fundamental accountability. You need to know who understands why this space exists and who can confirm if the membership list still makes sense as the months go by. When sharing settings change, or when the work finally ends and the space needs to be closed, there has to be a specific person to ask. If the answer to those questions is nobody, then that workspace has already turned into a future risk surface for the company. The same logic applies to the lifecycle of the data. Most organizations are great at understanding how to create things, but far fewer actually design the closure process well. Unfinished closure is how yesterday's project becomes today's discoverable, ownerless content layer that just sits there waiting to be found. To fix this, the pilot should include a basic lifecycle rule tied directly to the type of workspace being used. If it's a short-term project space, you review it right after the project window closes, but a department collaboration space should be reviewed on a completely different rhythm. For a sensitive initiative, you apply much tighter ownership and revalidation expectations from the start. We don't do this because every space needs heavy administration. We do it because every space needs a defined future. Now, map that same thinking to how we handle sensitivity. One of the biggest mistakes I see organizations make is treating sensitivity labeling like a user reminder instead of an environmental property. We expect people to remember complex classification decisions in the middle of active work while they are under deadline pressure. That is a fragile way to run a system. For this pilot, labels should align to the workspace type automatically whenever possible. If you are working in an open internal collaboration zone, the baseline should reflect that openness from the start. If it's a controlled partner space or a highly sensitive workspace, the protections should be there on day one rather than appearing as a cleanup task later. This doesn't remove human judgment, but it drastically reduces the guesswork. And reducing guesswork is one of the most practical forms of governance you can implement. Once those rules are in place, we define the zones clearly for everyone involved. This matters because a lot of risky behavior starts in environments that feel structurally vague to the people using them. People usually aren't ignoring the rules on purpose. They are just trying to navigate a space that doesn't clearly tell them what kind of collaboration it was built for. You only need to give the business a small number of zones they can actually understand. Open, controlled, and sensitive. Open collaboration means low friction internal work with clear boundaries, while controlled means tighter sharing expectations and perhaps some external involvement. Sensitive collaboration is the highest tier, requiring stronger protection and more deliberate governance around how data moves or how long it stays. If people can recognize their zone quickly, they make better decisions faster, and managers can sponsor the right environment without needing a translation manual. We also have to remember that connectors and apps are part of this design too. A resilient pilot cannot say yes to every single integration, but it also cannot hide those decisions behind a black box that nobody can see into. If the business asks for a specific connector, there needs to be a visible path to evaluate the use case and the data it touches. Visibility comes first, then the decision, which is very different from the vague prohibition that usually causes shadow IT to multiply. So how do we actually know if this pilot is working? We don't just ask if the controls were configured correctly in the back end. We measure the reduction in shadow usage, the faster startup times for new teams, and whether people stay inside the official environment longer. The real test isn't whether the governance became stricter, it's whether it became usable enough to actually hold the demand of the business. To make that sustainable, leaders need to develop a new kind of audit habit. What leaders should audit now? If you want to build a better audit habit, the first thing you have to do is stop looking at Microsoft 365 only as a control surface. You need to start auditing it as an operating environment. That might sound like a small distinction, but it completely changes what you look for when you open the reports. If all you review are admin roles and policy states, you will only see the architecture of intention, but you will never see the architecture of actual behavior. The behavior is where your structural debt shows up first. By all means, keep auditing your privileged access, your policy coverage, and your sharing settings, but you have to add a second layer to that review. You need to audit the specific moments where the work slows down, reroutes, or quietly leaves your platform entirely. I always suggest starting with waiting time to see how long it actually takes for a person to get the tools they need. Don't look at what the written process says or what the service target claims. Look at what the business actually experiences on a Monday morning. Long waiting times are not just an efficiency problem, they are a primary predictor of compensation behavior, where employees find their own workarounds. You should also audit your provisioning speed to see if creating a governed team depends on too many manual approvals for low-risk work. Next, you need to look at your inactive workspace volume. How many sites and groups are no longer active as working environments but still hold accessible content and inherited permissions? This number matters more than ever, because AI and modern search tools do not care if a space feels abandoned to a human. If the access remains, that content remains operationally relevant and potentially risky for the organization, then take a look at how your sharing grows over time. It's not just about whether external sharing is allowed, it's about how many links remain live and how many broad permissions are accumulating in different departments. That trend line will tell you exactly where convenience is slowly turning into exposure. You should also look at your connector spread to see which third-party apps and automations are attached to your environment. Your governance stops exactly where your visibility ends, so if you don't know where the connections are multiplying, you don't know where your control model is thinning out. There's one more category that most leadership teams still under audit, and that is workaround frequency. How often are your teams requesting urgent bypasses or reporting that the official route is simply too slow for the speed of their projects? Those are not just soft complaints from frustrated employees. They are hard risk signals that tell you exactly where your environment is failing to hold the demand. We have to change the language we use here. Oversharing is not just a user awareness problem, and shadow IT is not just a compliance issue. All of these behaviors can be read as direct design feedback from the people living inside the system every day. When leaders audit Microsoft 365 now, they should be asking 5 very direct questions about where work waits, where it duplicates, where it drifts, and where it leaves. But the most important question is why. If you only find the workaround and punish the person who used it, you will completely miss the underlying structure that produced that behavior in the first place. If you trace that workaround back to its source, whether it's friction, delay, or a missing governed path, you suddenly have something much more valuable than an incident record. You have a clear redesign target for your infrastructure. The real decision for leadership isn't whether risk exists in the system, it's whether you are willing to read that risk as a system outcome and finally respond at the level of design. The mindset shift. So this is the mindset shift we need to address. Risk in Microsoft 365 is no longer mainly about what people do wrong, but rather it is about what the platform defaults and the operating model make too hard to do right. That is a much harder sentence for leadership to accept because it pulls the conversation away from isolated users and places it back toward structural accountability. It suggests that the outcome is not random but is actually being produced by the system itself. If a specific result is being produced, then the question is not only who violated a policy, but what kind of environment made that violation or workaround predictable in the first place. This is where a lot of governance conversations still get stuck in the wrong frame. They talk about awareness, training, and tightening discipline, and while some of that matters, it rarely hits the root cause. If the environment keeps rewarding speed outside the governed path while punishing speed inside it, then training will never fix the core issue. Awareness will not remove the pressure, and another reminder email will not redesign the route people follow when they are under a deadline. People are juggling approvals and trying to get the work done without becoming the reason a project slipped, so they choose the path of least resistance. Because if you look closely, convenience feels productive in the short term for a very specific reason. It solves the immediate bottleneck that stands in the way of progress. Open sharing removes a delay, a duplicate team removes confusion for one specific group, and an unmanaged connector saves another long request cycle. Even using an external tool is just a way to get the meeting done today. That is why structural debt accumulates so quietly in these environments. It does not usually announce itself as a failure, but instead it arrives disguised as temporary progress. Because the short-term outcome looks helpful, organizations often normalize the behavior and call it practical or flexible. They tell themselves it was just what people needed to do at the time, but meanwhile, the underlying pattern of risk only gets stronger. More access expands, more workspaces linger, and more data spreads across the tenant. More tools connect, and more decisions happen in places the official governance model cannot fully read anymore. That is the debt we are talking about. It isn't one dramatic collapse, but rather repeated local convenience that creates long-term structural fragility. Once AI enters the environment at scale, that fragility becomes much more expensive to ignore. The issue is no longer just that the wrong person might eventually find the wrong file. Now, the environment itself can surface, summarize, and operationalize the consequences of years of loose structure and invisible compensation. So the winning posture here is not tighter control alone, but rather structural compensation in the right direction. That is the phrase I want to leave sitting with leadership for a minute, because compensation will happen either way. If the governed path is too slow, people will compensate outward to find a solution. If the governed path is clear, fast, and usable, people will compensate inward and choose the route that helps them move without creating a second invisible system. That is what better governance should actually do for a business. It shouldn't just block bad paths, but instead it should pull real work toward the good ones. And why is that important? It's because safer work must become easier work if we expect people to actually do it. We aren't talking about being theoretically safer or safer if someone has time to read 4 pages of policy. We are talking about being operationally safer, which means the system is faster to start, clearer to use, and easier to sustain. If leaders miss that, they will keep trying to solve structural debt with more oversight layered onto the same fragile roots that created the problem. They will keep measuring coverage while behavior drifts. And they will keep calling the environment governed while the business quietly builds its own alternatives around the edges. But if leaders do make this shift, the whole conversation changes for the better. Shadow IT becomes useful feedback, oversharing becomes architecture debt made visible, and workspace sprawl becomes a clear operating model signal. AI governance becomes less about fear and more about whether the underlying collaboration system is actually worthy of amplification. That is a much more useful frame for a CTO or an architect. It removes some of the blame from the people inside the system and puts the design responsibility where it belongs. The responsibility sits on leadership, on architecture, and on the choices that define how work is allowed to move. So the real question now is not whether Microsoft 365 is secure on paper, but whether your environment is designed to keep the business inside governed pathways when the pressure is real. Because that is where resilience lives in a modern organization. It doesn't live in the appearance of control, but in the ability to hold real work without forcing it to split, drift, or disappear into places your governance can no longer reach. So here's the point I'd leave you with. The biggest risks in Microsoft 365 usually don't start with people doing the wrong thing, but they start when the environment makes the right thing too hard to sustain. If you want more conversations like this, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and send me a message on LinkedIn with the risk pattern you can already see inside your own tenant. Whether it is oversharing, workspace sprawl, connector drift, or Copilot readiness, I want to hear what you are seeing. And if you audited your Microsoft 365 risk the same way you audit business architecture, what would you find? More importantly, is that environment designed to sustain the business, or is it slowly draining your resilience over time?